A pleasant day to everyone. My name is Elijah and I'm here to present my paper entitled Quaranscenes of Filipino Religiosity, an analysis of performing online devotion to the Black Nazarene during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the contents of my presentation, I'll first provide an introduction followed by my main argument and the framework that I used. Afterwards, I'll discuss my key findings and analysis, and finally end with my conclusion. First, let us look at the Nazareno from a historical perspective. The year 1606 it presumably arrived at the first batch of recollection missionaries. Oral tradition suggests that there were two images of the Black Nazarene. The older and more grandiose image, which was enshrined at the main altar of the Recoletos Church, was destroyed during the 1945 Battle of Manila, and the other, a dusky variant near the entrance of the church, became more popular with the populace. Later on, the second image was transferred to the Church of San Juan Bautista on the Feast of the Holy Name of Jesus on the 9th of January. It is this event, the Traslacion, which is commemorated every year. Finally, the people of Manila found a valid excuse to hold a pompous fiesta. Since then, what is properly the Traslacion has become synonymous with the town's fiesta. There are several external manifestations of devotion to the Black Nazarene. All of these acts are performed in the presence of the Nazareno, which is important to understand the religious devotion and motivation of the devotees. But what if these acts were not performed directly in the presence of the Nazareno? How then would these acts of devotion transform just as religious space is invented as it transitioned online? For this topic, the title I chose features the word quarantines, which is an interplane between quarantine and scenes. This study is an attempt to narrate and explain how Filipino religiosity persisted and transformed through the COVID-19 pandemic and the quarantine implemented by the government. Such persistence and transformation is a reflection of devotion and should not be dismissed because it is manifested through the act of performing devotion online. Through this transition, there is now question on the relevance of physical space as a shared space amidst the pandemic. As such, for this study, much of the focus is on devotion practices conducted online on the Quiapo Church's Facebook page, with additional focus on the online devotion practices performed by devotees. As a paper on Catholicism in Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, it highlights on the performance of online devotion to the Nazareno. In explaining Filipino religiosity, the essence itself has not changed. It is only manifested in another medium. For this study, I employed ethnography or online ethnography, which is an online research method that adapts ethnographic methods to the study of the communities and cultures created through computer-mediated social interaction. Through this method, I was able to conduct interviews through teleconferencing apps, through discussions via instant messaging apps, and formal interview questions answered through Google Forms. Finally, I also conducted an online fieldwork wherein I watched and participated in the religious activities that were live streamed by the Quiapo Church through their Facebook page. Here, I mainly argue that physical presence of the devotee and the Nazareno in a shared public space is important, but is not relevant anymore. It is in times of adversity like this, when one cannot go into the shared space with the Nazareno, that a longing to personally see, touch, and pray in his presence is so strong. Devotees now adjust and don't mind that they cannot see him physically given the circumstances of the pandemic. Therefore, physical space is irrelevant. What is important for the devotees right now is the taus-pusong pagbibigay ng pananampalataya. Thus, I view online devotion as a performance. Generally, performance is to do something up to a standard and to show off to go to extremes to underline an action for those who are watching. It has something to do with achieving a change in stature that occurs in a liminal space of heightened intensity that is separate from routine life. From the commonalities of theater and ritual as performances, they enact a transformation in being or consciousness that occur in a state of intensity and enables interactions between audience and performer and consists of a whole sequence of behaviors before and after the main event on display. Finally, it is seen as an inherent human activity, an essential aspect of human communicative capacity, seen as pervading virtually all institutions of public expressive behavior. Through this, we can answer these questions, and in doing so, we can see how this successful online performance represents the accomplishment of cultural representation, resulting in the transformation of society. In Peter Brook's Beginning of the Empty Space, he assumes that a theater performance consists of three basic components: actor, spectator, and space. According to him, performances are dependent on a space in which actor and spectator come together and agree on a place which they call stage. It is in this real space that they imagine a fictional world. The empty space, which Brooke defines in his work, is not realistic. It rather symbolizes his need to liberate his artistic talent from the fixed and institutionalized. So if there's no empty space, what then do we make of the space where the action is performed? Thus, I look into event space, as coined by architect Bernard Schumi. He mentions that the architecture is not just about space and form, but also the events happening inside. Here he uses event space to bridge theatrical and spatial theory, and this becomes a useful paradigm for articulating how space performs and how performance is spatialized by the event. This calls us to not limit space to the architecture or the physical sense, but now we must look at this through event space. Thus, there is no space without the event. If performance is both a doing and a thing done, then spacing represents both noun and verb, thing and action. Because action in space has a reciprocal relationship with space in action. Our banal everyday environments can be perceived and utilized as continually fluctuating performances. This is further confounded by how the so-called real world is informed by the virtual worlds emerging from various media and our own imaginations. Considering performance space as evental repositions built and imagined space as both embodied experience and evolving time-based event, religious spaces is no longer perceived as a static object but a volatile spatial object. A theory of the event therefore undermines the proper place of religiosity traditionally cited in religious spaces. And so, carrying that view on event space, we acknowledge that online devotions as a performance, it results in its unhousing and desire to leave the conventional religious space, that discipline the spatial practices of devotees, dictating how they act, react, and interact, while the dramatic event negotiates within real time and fictive time, existing site and scenography. The quotidian event focuses on what Shumi refers to as the spectacle of everyday life, which is neither singular nor isolated, but fragmented, overlapping, and mobile. So empty space challenges us to regard any space not only as a site for performance, but as a performer in waiting, thus reducing the staged event to a raw spatial encounter between participants. As a spatial event, the religious space, traditionally perceived as rigid and enduring, admits the more dynamic, ephemeral, and temporal aspects of performance. As a result, devotion to the Nazareno transcends religious places of worship. While the religious architecture may foster or frustrate dramatic action, it is not the source of this devotion. Once the devotion is cast, the limits of physical space becomes irrelevant. Broadly, this is evident in how we all adjusted to quarantine, wherein the physical space became irrelevant due to the internet. As virtual space, you're not there, but you're actually there. Therein happens the quarantines of online performances in the virtual space, wherein everyday quotidian activities are now done online. And perhaps it is true that places are created and defined through the distinctive activities that take place therein. And such practice space becomes a place when it develops significance by its inhabitants or users. Ultimately, the online religious place then would seem to be more than an empty space, but rather as a practice space for bodies to perform and to be observed within. And such is evident when devotees innovate how they perform their devotion when everything transitioned online. Most of the devotees that were interviewed often prepared an area where they could devote their undivided attention to perform their devotion at a given hour of each day. Gradually, towards the start of the program, they felt how the physical space transformed as the event brought them, as if they were within the shared space. There they felt, even if the mode or place is completely new, the act of devotion feels the same, but it has only changed to adapt to the new medium. From the unabating chanting of prayers and wishes in the presence of the Nazareno to the constant prayers in the comment section of the live stream. From gazing the Nazareno from afar to gazing the Nazareno closely through live stream. From dictating responses to commenting the same, evidently in this case, while the quarantine event space is invented, the performance of devotion is innovated, meaning it has only changed a ritual that is already there by adjusting their performance to suit new circumstances. And so I realized that performance is an act confined to its own event space. As a performance, online devotion carries the same essence and importance. It is something that is thought of, something that is acted, and something that imitates devotion as if it was done in the religious space. In fact, it is not you who adjust to the space when you practice devotion. Now it is the space that seems to adjust to the performance of online devotion. We must view religious space not in its physical limitations, but as an event space, one that transcends religious places of worship because it is not the source of devotion. From the words of Cardinal Tagle, it comes from the taus-pusong pagbibigay ng pananampalataya, pagmamahal na wagas, katapatan na naglilingkod, at pakikipagkaisa kay Jesus. Ultimately, it doesn't matter where you practice your devotion. What matters is that you practice your devotion and that you find meaning in doing so. The fact that you thought of it and it has moved you into action is in itself a performance. With that, I end my paper presentation. Thank you and good day.